It's time for mixing. You guys requested mixing content more often than not, and I'm happy to give you some of that, as mixing is something I really love, and I think there is a art in mixing that is sometimes even underestimated. So today we're starting off the mixing series with an overview over compression and some nice tips on how to handle and learn it well. Since I don't have my own compressor plugin that I can give you for free, there's only going to be some drum loops available for you. So follow the link in the description and get your drum loops and try to train your compression skills. Compression. You can see a lot of compressors here. Let me open those. External ones, right? We have different stuff here. And when we talk about compression, there's some stuff that we have to discuss first. And this is like the general concept of what you can do with a compressor. So first of all, have you heard of the word dynamic range before? What dynamic range means is, what's the difference between the loudest and the most quiet part of a sound, for example, or even the song, depending on what you're talking about. So the dynamic range tells you something about the difference between loud and quiet in a sound. And this is very important because with compressors, we want to take the dynamic range and either make it bigger or smaller. And this is already kind of the whole thing. Like, this is what you have to understand when you're using compression. You want to change the dynamic range of a sound, which means you want to change the difference between the loudest and the most quiet parts of a sound. Then there's two more words that I want to define first: loudness and transients. What is loudness? You all know what it means when a song is played out loud, right? Someone put the master volume up to maximum, maybe put the channel on red. We don't do that though. But you know, loud basically means stronger air pressure, so you would think that is louder, right? Your ear consumes it as louder. Loudness is something completely else. Loudness, as we use it, describes actually the dynamic range. So the loudness is measured in LUFS, right? You maybe heard of that. Lean Loudness Meter, for example, is a free plugin that shows you the LUFS of your song, a sound, whatever you put it on, right? And those values go from 0 down to minus something. And the loudness of techno tracks, for example, or general electronic music tracks range from maybe -5 to -9 or something. So they're actually already very compressed. So music back in the days was maybe at -18 to -20 LUFS, which is nothing compared to electronic music loudness. But what you have to know when I say loudness is, if I say, oh, has more loudness now, it means the dynamic range is smaller, so the quietest part of a sound is closer to the loudest part, and therefore we conceive it as louder. It doesn't mean it is played out louder, but just because it's louder overall, we think it's stronger, louder, and for most of the times our ears think it's better as well. So the other word I mentioned was transients. You have to know what's a transient. A transient, defined by physical means, is a signal peak. So what that means is you would have a signal, could be anything, but we are talking about audio signals, and then there's a sudden peak. So which means the signal gets much louder for a short period of time. So those transients happen to be, for example, when you hit a drum, right? When you hit, for example, a kick drum on a drum kit, you would hit the kick drum and then you would have first this initial hit and then the bass, right? So the bass is the body, while the initial hit is what we would also call the transient. And transients are very important for compression, but because compression is always about handling transients, or is often about handling transients. Either your transient could be too loud, right? Your drum could be way too transient. It could have too much of a hit and not enough body behind that. right? So you would want the body to be louder or the transient to be quieter. It could also be the other way around. You could have a transient that is way too weak and your drums are not really audible through your mix, right? So you would want the transient to be louder in order to cut through the mix. So this is actually already the 3 most important words that I want you to know. And now let's have a look at the different compressors here. Let me close them all for you again. So first of all, we have the Ableton compressor, and he has all the standard settings a compressor needs. So we have ratio, attack, release, threshold, and output. And we can see almost identically here attack, release, ratio, threshold, makeup, which is essentially an output. And if we look at, for example, the FabFilter Pro C2, we have exactly the same things. We have attack, release, ratio, threshold, and output. Obviously, the FabFilter has a lot more functions, but still, those are the basic ones. Then, for example, we have the Fairchild, and the Fairchild also has kind of the same thing. We have a threshold here, we have an input gain and an output gain, so this one is a little different. And then we don't see attack and release here, right? We only see time constant. So we know that attack and release has something to do with time, as we know from envelopes, for example. And this is kind of the way we can work with that here. Then we have the LA2A, very famous compressor as well. Here we don't have as much. We only have a gain and a peak reduction. Peak reduction, it's hard to tell what this is, like from just looking at it. Could be something like ratio, right? And gain could be something like input gain or threshold. We're gonna get back to this in a moment. But yeah, not that much to do here, right? Instead, we have a difference between compressing and limiting, which we're also gonna talk about later. And then if we look at this, for example, this is a mastering compressor, the Shadow Hills. And here we have kind of everything that we talked about before, but in a much more complicated looking way, right? This is actually many different instances of a compressor. For example, here we have the optical threshold and optical gain, but there is no attack and release. While here on the discrete side of the coin, for example, we have the discrete threshold, the discrete gain, ratio, attack, and recover, which is the same as release, right? So you can see those are the ones that are always in every, or like almost always in every compressor. And now let's talk quickly about it, what they mean. So let's start with the threshold. What a compressor does is it lowers the volume of the signal at a certain point, and at which point is defined by the threshold. So if we put it, for example, to minus 10.5 dB, as it says here, everything that goes above minus 10.5 dB will get compressed, which means it will be lowered in volume. While everything that is under minus 10.5 dB will not be touched by the compressor, it will stay exactly the same. And this is how we can change the dynamic range of a sound, because something that is loud, for example, can be made quieter, while the quiet things still stay the same, and therefore the dynamic range gets smaller, right? So how does this right lowering of the volume work? There's the ratio, attack, and release, and those are the ones that determine how it works. So the ratio is kind of the strength of a compressor. For example, if we put it to 1:1, there's nothing happening at all. If we put it to 1:4, there's much more compression going on, which means the volume gets lower at the, like above the threshold, right? If we put it even higher, there's even more compression going to be applied to the point where it's infinite, right? So there's like the maximum amount. So then we have attack and release, and those are time-based values. So what they mean is, let's start on the attack. Attack is the value that decides how long it takes the compressor when the signal reached the threshold to actually start working. What that means is, think of a kick drum. The kick drum has the initial hit, and let's say this initial hit already crosses our threshold. If our attack is set to 93 milliseconds, from this initial hit that crossed the threshold, it will take 93 milliseconds until it actually starts compressing. While if we put this to 0.01 milliseconds, it kind of starts right at the crossing of the threshold. The release is like kind of the opposite. It says how long does it take the compressor when the threshold is not crossed anymore to go back to its original volume. So imagine like we had this, and the threshold would be crossed, like after 1 millisecond we would have the compression, and then the threshold is not crossed anymore. So if I put the release to 440 now, after the threshold is not crossed anymore, it will take 440 seconds for the compressor to go back to the original volume. And that's it, actually. That's all the important knobs you need, right? You have the output gain, which is kind of obvious at this point, because since compression lowers the volume of a sound, you kind of want to get this volume back because you still want the signal to have the original volume. You just want to lower the dynamic range, right? So for example, if we had a gain reduction, this is another word, of 4 dB, which is shown here. It says 0.0 right now, but if we have a gain reduction of 4 dB, then we want to go 4 dB out as well. So the signal is still the same, has still the same volume, but not the same loudness, if you know what I'm talking about. So enough theory, let's get this going with our first example. In our first example, the thing that we really want to talk about is the attack time, because it's one of the most important values of a compressor. So let me take all these off. I want to show you all of this with the FabFilter Pro C2, because it has a very, very good visual, like it really shows well, because it visually shows what's happening very well. So here I have a breakbeat loop that we can get a little bit louder. And I'm resetting the compressor to a threshold of 0, which is not crossed yet, so nothing happens, right? So we're gonna set the release to something that doesn't really matter right now. So let's just put it to 100, and the ratio I wanna have at around 1:4, which is not a fair amount, but not too much, right? And the attack can now be either long or short. There's a big difference between having a long and a short attack. And I want to show you now that this is two completely different ways of using compression. So let's put the threshold somewhere where it actually starts working, somewhere around here. And let's put the attack to absolutely nothing, the most minimum we can have, 0.005 milliseconds, which means it works instantly. So up here, the compressor shows us the gain reduction now, which is 5.9 dB, which means that we can raise our volume around 6 dB, right? So we put this up. The sounds are kind of at the same volume now, but you can already hear that the compressed version feels stronger, right? This is because the lower parts, like with the less volume, come closer to the highest volume, right? But what happens to our transients now? That's the big question. If we have a short attack and we listen to the transients of our sound, listen to the snare. Focus on the snare. You might have noticed that while it gets more body in the end, it kind of loses some of its initial hit. And this is what happens with the slow attack, because there is the transient of the snare, but the compressor works immediately, which means already the transient gets pulled down heavily. While if we put up the attack, let's say, for example, to 50 milliseconds, or maybe even a little bit more to make it more obvious, look what's happening now. Our sound just got louder, like in volume. Why? That happened because now there's not that much compression applied anymore, because it takes the compressor longer to even start. And what's even more important is the transient hits, but only 70 milliseconds later the compressor will start to compress, which means the transient is not affected by the compressor at all. And if you compare those two versions now, like let's go back to the 70 milliseconds. As I said before, try to replay this maybe sometimes and focus on the snare. There's a huge difference in the snare drum with a setting like this and a setting like this. You will hear that if you have a long attack, the transients of the sound can come through, and this is like what I just said before, that there's two essentially different ways of using a compressor thanks to the attack. Having a long attack therefore helps us to make the transient even more louder, like get the transient really up front. For example, also if we didn't have that much of a transient, we could still push it a little bit by compressing the sound, but having a long attack which will essentially compress the whole sound except for the transient. While the other way around, if we have a short attack, the transient is the loudest and first thing that will get pushed down. So if we have a kick drum that's a little bit too clicky, let's use a short attack. If we have a kick drum that's not clicky enough, let's do it the other way around. So this is the most important, in my opinion, distinction that you have to make when you're using compression, because if you don't know about this difference, there's a 50% chance every time that you will get it wrong. You really have to think about what do we want for the sound and how do I accomplish this. For example, this breakbeat here, I think it could have a little bit more of a transient and some sounds, so I would like this to be a little more like, you know, have stronger hits, and therefore I would go with a longer attack. We could actually stay around this, and I would go for a little less of the ratio because I don't want the rest to be pulled down too much. And now let's have a last listen. So now we could hear that with those settings, we got a little bit more of transients on the sound and also a little bit of compression in general. So everything of body-wise, everything that was a little more quiet, like for example, this long tail of the snare got pushed up just a little bit. So that's also something very important. Just as a side fact, compression doesn't always have to be super strong and change the sound completely. Sometimes it's enough to have like 1 dB gain reduction and just take away a little bit of the transient, or put the body a little bit closer together, right? So compression is something that you shouldn't overuse, and you should really be aware of what you're doing when you're using it, because you can also completely mess up a sound just by using the wrong compressor settings. But that shouldn't stop you from doing it. Instead, you should take the drum loops that you get for free and put your compressor on and try out different settings and try to learn how they work. So in one of our latest videos about the top 5 free plugins for electronic music production, I've shown you this Smexoscope. If you haven't seen this video, check it out here. In this video, we want to use the Smexoscope to learn compression, because it shows us what we did. What do I mean by that? So we have a 909 snare drum here. Freeze this now, and you can see the exact volume shape of this sound now. So you can see that there's actually a very spiky transient, and then there's like kind of a long body, but it's not too like loud in that way, right? So there could be different approaches to what we want to do. For example, we could say, it shouldn't be that much of a transient, right? We want to cut the transient. So big question, what do we have to do with our compressor? We have to use short attack settings, because we want to hit the transient with the compressor already. Since the transient is very short, as I said before, we need short attack times to catch the transient already. So we're going to take that, put it to the minimum just for showing it, and the ratio can stay like this, and watch what happens to the wave here if I put down the threshold. You see this? Our snare drum looks completely different now. There's still a little bit of a transient, but it's not that loud, and it got much quieter in general. Look how tiny this waveform is. That's a problem, and this is why we have the output gain, so we can have a look at what the gain reduction says here. It says -11, so we can go something like this. Let's try 10 or 9 or something. And now I think you can hear a strong difference in sound. Let's click this off and on and have a look at this mixoscope as well. I froze it instantly because here we have the two now next to each other. So this one is the not compressed version, while this one is the compressed version. So what happened? Here we had a strong transient and not too much of a loud body, while here the body is much closer to the transient. Now the transient got quieter. So this is exactly what I said that we want to do, right? We want to put down the transient and maybe get the body up a little bit. So this is what we do with a short attack time once again, and see how oscilloscope gives us the answer if we did it right. Right, if it looked different now, if we had an even louder transient and the body would look different, then we knew we didn't do it right. At least if we wanted to do that, right? So now let's check it out another way around. Let's use a long attack on this snare drum and check out what happens here. So now I froze the two again. This is the non-compressed version. This is the compressed version. What happened? We had a long attack, actually not that long, 40 milliseconds. I mean, it could be longer, but it's already considered long, I would say. Still the same ratio, still the same release, and the threshold got a little lower. And what happened? We got such a spiky transient. Look at this. This is insane. This can never be used effectively in any mix. I guess so, because you would not hear anything of the snare except for its some milliseconds attack. And sounds like this are mostly not used in music production, and this is also one of the reasons why compressors are so important, because sometimes you would have a sound like this, or you would have several sounds on top of each other, resulting in something that looks like this. For example, think of a kick and a snare drum together, both having a transient, like you would have kick and then kick and snare on the two. And the snare and the kick drum together have a very spiky transient. So you could put them in a group, put a compressor in the group, and lower the transient when they hit together with compression. Smexoscope, respectively any other oscilloscope, is very, very helpful to learn how compression works, because you can actually see what you did. And it's very easy to hear what compression did. Like, for example, this one, I would say, even with just a little bit of understanding and training on how to hear compression, you will already hear what's happening to the snare drum. Well, sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes bass compression or the whole drum bass compression is not that simple to hear. And therefore, something like Smexoscope can be super, super helpful. One more trick that I want to show you. It's something that producers already found out about a long time ago, and they call it New York compression, presumably because it was found in New York. I'm actually not that sure about that. But anyways, that's just a word for it. It's actually called parallel compression. And parallel in music production always means that you would have something and the same thing, but some way different. And instead of like using only the different version, you would put the normal and the different version together to get like the best of both worlds. And compression is the perfect candidate for parallel processing. Here I have two different instances. First I have an audio effect rack with one empty chain. Let's call this empty. And one compressed chain. And you can see we have like exactly the same settings here. Instead, we have like a little bit of a different threshold here, actually a big difference, but you will see why this is okay. And yes, what's happening here? We have this glue compressor, which is very good for compressing several sounds together. So we would have this drum loop here. And if we put in the compressor, it sounds like this. So what we're getting from this glue compressor is a nice overall loudness, but because of the kind of short attack with 1 millisecond here, we also lose some of the nice transients of our drum, which is not so nice. So what we want to do here instead is using parallel compression to have both the loudness and the transients. So how does it work? Let's switch up to this audio effect rack. First of all, we have this empty chain. This is just the usual drum beat. Now let's listen to the compressed one. This is a very heavy example, but I still want to show it to you because it's actually kind of used like this in a lot of ways. So first of all, still kind of the same settings, cutting a lot of transients, and the threshold is much lower because I wanted it to be even more compressed. Like if we would put this only on the signal, then that wouldn't be too nice. And this goes to show you why parallel compression is so nice, because if we use such an intense compressor like this, we could never use this only, because the sound would be completely put down to nothing, right? But if we put it in a chain and mix it together with the original, what we get now, you have to think of it like a picture. We have the nice drum loop with not a lot of loudness, but already nice transients. And then we would have this compressed chain, which is like a super compressed version of the drum loop, no transients at all. If we add this up now, there will not be a huge difference in the transients because the transients are so quiet in the compressed version, but there's a huge difference in loudness because the compressed version adds up to the original. So in the end, if we compare this again, it sounds like this. So parallel compression basically is there to say, okay, I want the transients, but I also want loudness, so let me get the best of both worlds and use parallel compression. So covering such a big topic like compression is not that easy, especially not in a 20 to 25 minute YouTube video, which I hope this is not longer. But still, I think that was an overview for you guys, and also an overview about some techniques that are very helpful when learning compression. But still, there's plenty of more stuff to be discovered. For example, what is look ahead? What is knee? How does sidechain compression work? Why is there so many different compressors, and what are their qualities? So if you want to see more on compressors, just leave a comment down here. Let me know what you want to see. Any other mixing tips are also welcome. Like if you want to know more about equalizing or using reverb and delay to create dimension, those are all topics that I have in mind and that I want to cover in the future. So let me know what of this you want to see first. Until then, have a good time, guys, and keep making music.